Welcome back to my channel, friends. This is Korin Sutherland. I'm going to be sharing an art journal page with you today. So this page starts out with a prayer that I wrote out on, pretty much covered the whole page. And I do this a lot of times when I art journal because it's just kind of a way for me to focus on just maybe whatever the Lord taught me in my Bible reading that day, or if there's a burden on my heart. Just kind of helps me to center my focus on the Lord and just who He is and what He is capable of in my life. So I like to write these prayers down. A lot of people ask me, why do you write them down and then cover them? And really it's more for just me to, like I said, get it out and bring it before the Lord, and then I cover it up because it's between Him and me. So I don't have to go back and read that again. You know, He already knows my heart, and so that is the main reason I do that. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking some basically strips of paper that were left over from some spray and stencil playing that I was doing, and I'm just covering my entire page. That's literally all I'm doing. And I'm using some art glitter glue to do that. Now that I've got my whole page covered, it's really just for the colors and the textures that are going on. I didn't want to waste those strips of paper. So this is kind of a fun way to use them. You've still got texture in the background and lots of interesting things going on. So now I'm taking some gesso. This is just white gesso. And I'm just applying this with my finger over certain areas of this background. Now I will tell you, these background pieces, all the little strips and the larger piece there, they were created using distress sprays. So by using a wet medium, which would be the gesso, and going over those, there is a little bit of color that's kind of blending together because it's reactivating that color. So just FYI, if you ever do this, don't be alarmed if you do notice that your inks kind of reactivate and move around. So after drying that with my heat tool, I'm coming in and now I want to add a few torn book pages, little pieces of torn book page to add a little bit more interest and texture over top of this background. I'm using Matte Gel Medium by Liquitex to apply this. A lot of people use Mod Podge, and that's totally fine as well if that's your preferred adhesive and sealant for this type of a thing. I just tend to prefer the matte gel medium. I like just the feel of it a little bit better, and it is more matte in my opinion than the Mod Podge. So I'm still kind of playing around, finding little spots. Oh, maybe I'll put some text here, maybe I'll put some here. So I'm just going in and adding a couple of other spots with that matte gel medium. And sometimes what I'll do, because the matte gel is kind of thicker, I will sometimes spritz some water into the jar, or I'll take a wet paintbrush and I'll apply it that way. That just helps to thin it out a little bit so that it spreads easier. And now what I'm doing is covering the entire page. I want to seal everything up. I don't want any more of that distress spray to run or reactivate. So here is my finished background, and I'm going to go ahead and dry that with my heat tool. Just always using the heat tool between every single step because it's easier to work on dry surfaces. So now I'm coming back in, now that I've added the text areas, I'm coming back in with the gesso and my finger, and I'm softening that, some of those edges and some of those areas. Basically what happens when you're doing mixed media in this way, where you're collaging and adding layers, is you're pushing each layer towards the back. And every layer, as you add more layers in gesso, you're kind of sending it a little bit further to the back and a little bit further to the background so that you can see all of the layers of texture, especially up close. I mean, this video, obviously I filmed it a little bit differently, the angle, but the texture is just amazing when you see these up close. So now I'm taking some texture paste. I don't think this texture paste, this particular kind, is made anymore, which is a total bummer because I love it. But I think it's from Finnabar, and they do have some texture pastes still that they do, but this particular one, I think it's called a paper texture paste. It just has a different feel to it. I cannot find it anymore, so I might have to look again, but I don't know if they make it anymore. So I'm using one of my newest stencils that was released this month at Creative Worship Stamps, and this is the Brick Wall stencil. And I'm just obviously applying this with a palette knife. It is a little tricky with that spiral bound journal to get my stencil to cooperate with me there, so I was having to fight with it a little bit to keep it in place, but it's all good. The texture is the extra texture. If you make a mistake, is really not a problem when you're art journaling. So now, of course, I have to heat dry that layer again, and just giving you a little bit of a better angle there at the view. So now I want to add a little bit of a brown, kind of like a distress look to this, antique look, I guess I could say. So I'm using some alcohol ink, and I put a couple of drops on just a ceramic plate that I use as a palette, and spritz it with water so that it's runnier. I want it to be nice and wet, and I'm just applying this with a paintbrush around some of the edges. And I still, again, I want it to be more wet. I want it to run, so I've spritzed it with some water, moving my page around, lifting the book, obviously turning it every which way because I want it to spread and run very organically. And so I just continue to do this with my paintbrush and that watered down acrylic ink. So spritzing, adding more, just until I'm satisfied with how it's going to look. And then, of course, again, yes, you need to dry in between. So we'll dry this. A lot of the drying time I have cropped out of, or snipped or trimmed, whatever you want to call it, out of this video. So you're missing a lot of the drying time. That's probably one of the most time-consuming things of this process, is just all that drying time in between each layer. So now I'm coming in. Now that the page is dry, I want to add some of those brown paint splatters, or whatever you want to call it, ink splatters, onto my page. So I'm just doing that all around. You can see how cool that looks. Just another level of texture, and drying again. So now I decide that I still want more. I kind of like, as I'm doing this process, I'm looking at my page. I'm like, okay, I think I want a little bit more of this here, or I'm not sure how I feel about that. So I do continue to, tweak and add as I go. So now I'm going to actually take a stamp. This is a background stamp. It's called Typewriter Text Background. And I'm inking it up in black archival ink. And I'm just adding that just in a few places to my page. I believe I'm going to show you. Yep, there we go. Show you so you can see it looks really cool with that text. I've brought that to the foreground now a little bit more. And now I'm going to take the Mini Marks 1 stamp, and I'm going to add a few areas of marks. But you'll notice that after I do this, I am not really sure if I like it. So I'm going to clean my stamp, and I'm actually going to come back in with some of the gesso, and I'm going to cover up those areas a little bit. This is what happens sometimes. We're doing in the process, throughout the process of just playing, freely playing. Sometimes we do a layer and we're like, I don't really love that. So it's okay. There is no reason that we can't cover it up. That is the beauty of mixed media. I am coming in with the gesso, sending those marks back a little bit to the background. I just don't like how dark they are. I don't know. I wasn't feeling it. So Just cleaning my hands off there with my towel. I keep a towel nearby and I spritz it with water when I have mediums and stuff that I want to clean off my hands. And so it's a great little way to clean up without going through tons and tons of paper towels. So now, because I've covered up that stamped area that I didn't care for, I do want to come back in and bring some of that brown back in. So I'm adding that to the edges, and I really like how that brown, especially how it's darker around the edges, just really love how that looks. And of course, because I did cover up a lot of the splatters, I'm going in and adding more splatters. I just happen to have enough of that ink, that acrylic ink on my my little plate there, that I could go ahead and add the splatters back in. So now I've picked a focal point, and I'm gonna fussy cut this out. This is an image that was stamped on cardstock. It's like a thicker cardstock, and I'm just gonna fussy cut this. Unfortunately, I don't have dies for this particular image. The image is from a stamp set called In This Together, and it's a large stamp set in the Creative Worship Stamps line. Beautiful little cluster of 3 flowers. So I'm going to cut this out, and then I'm going to add some color to it so that it can be part of the main focal point of my page. I'm going to use watercolors. I'm just kind of playing around with placement and trying to figure out what I want to do here. Grabbing some scraps and things. I'm just kind of playing around with this as I decide where I want to go. And I did make a decision, but I kind of set that stuff aside so that I could sit and color color the image. So I'm going to use watercolors. The first palette that I'm using is, I believe, a Prima palette. It's got a lot of blues and greens in it. And I'm just going to come in and basically loosely watercolor the leaves and everything. And when I watercolor, I'm not a professional watercolorer. I just do watercolorist. How do you say that? I don't know. I just do what feels right. I try to, add shading. I still don't totally love my watercoloring. When I color with watercolors, I tend to prefer using Copic markers to color. I feel like I'm more confident with those, but I don't let that stop me from coloring with watercolors. I just want to continue to learn and practice and improve my skill. So I have put away that other watercolor palette, and now I'm using the Jane Davenport Brights palette. This is my most used watercolor palette. I absolutely love it. I'm going to cry when I run out if I can't ever get it again. So just going in, I always mix colors in my lids, in the tin part of the top part. That's always a messy palette for me. It's a great way for me to mix different colors and get shades that don't actually come in the palette itself. So you can kind of see me, mixing the colors in there and cleaning the brush in between, of course. And I do wish, just kind of a side note, I guess, I wish that you could see better this coloring part, because I know it's kind of difficult to see at this angle. But the reason I filmed this at a different angle because I wanted to sort of test out this angle. I wanted you to be able to see more of what's going on kind of outside of the actual page itself. I think a lot of times when we film from up above, there's a lot of things that you don't see. And I thought maybe it would be interesting to see some of those things. Obviously my desk is a mess and I've got supplies everywhere. But, that's reality. That's what it's like when you create. So you'll have to let me know what you think of this angle. It's, you might not love it. It's totally fine. But I'm just sort of testing it out, like I said. So now that image is finished, as far as the watercoloring, I'm adding more paint splatters. I want to draw that brown splatter into that image. So that looks really fun. I love how that turned out. Of course, we've got to dry it with our heat tool. It's a lot easier to glue things down when they are dry. So now I'm going to grab those things I had set aside earlier, and this little square that I'm using, that I'm getting ready to stamp on, is actually a scrap left over from some distress spray backgrounds that I had made. It's kind of some of the overspray, if you will. And I love to save these little pieces. The pieces that you cut off that you're like, oh, this isn't what I want to use. Maybe you would typically throw in the trash. I like to save them because you can use them for different things. And this is an example of that. So I'm using the Misty and I'm stamping the Christmas wish list stamp onto this little square. But I'm not, because the stamp is taller than the square, I'm omitting the part that says Christmas wish list. So you can't, all you see is the check boxes and the notebook kind of paper. And that was obviously on purpose because I wasn't making anything Christmassy. So as I'm playing around, I noticed that I didn't really like the straight edges along the sides. So I decided to tear this paper. This is watercolor paper, so it's a little tricky to tear. It's very thick, but I managed to get it done. And now I'm going to do a little bit of messy writing. This is another way to add texture and interest to an art journal page. I'm literally just writing out a little prayer directly onto the page with kind of a pretty fine tip pen. I do end up rewriting it with a darker pen later because I didn't like how light it was, but we'll get to that later. The messy prayer is just kind of again, me kind of bringing it all back, keeping that focus. This whole process is all part of creative worship because I'm mindful of whatever God is teaching me, whatever I'm maybe, pouring out to Him during this time, a burden on my heart, whatever. And so I always try to incorporate, not only did I write a prayer and then cover it to start out, but I've also added a prayer on top then as well. So you can't read it. I probably can't read it. It's very messy. It's just a messy form of writing. But I know what I was saying as I wrote it. So obviously you see me gluing all these pieces down. I'm using I'm using art glitter glue. Goodness, I'll get it right. And here I take because there's so much texture, I needed to put a heavy book on top of there just for a few minutes so that it would dry, that it would stick to the page without me having to hold it there for a while. So now I've got my Zig Writer, my absolute favorite pen ever, and I'm using the blunt tip to write out the word surrender. So here's the thing. This is kind of funny, kind of silly. The word was way too big for my little notebook page, but I was like, I don't even care. This is my art journal spread. I'm just going to hyphenate it. Yes, it's weird. It's totally strange and maybe think it's funny, but it is what it is. So now I'm taking that pen, the other side of my Zig Writer, and like I mentioned, I'm rewriting, kind of tracing over my other writing because I wanted it to be darker. It just wasn't, that pen that I used at first wasn't quite right. So there it is. Now you can see my full page. I love how the colors all turned out. It's really a cool page. So much texture. I hope you enjoyed this process and I hope it inspires you to get creative. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.